Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're stepping back into 18th century North America. It was quite the stage, wasn't it? A real battleground for empires like France, Britain, and Spain, all vying for control.
Absolutely. The stakes were incredibly high. And what our sources really illuminate is the French story, how they established themselves, particularly up in Canada, and how all those interactions, well, they really paved the way for that huge conflict, the French and Indian War.
Yeah, we've got some great historical excerpts here. So the mission today is to really unpack those key moments, the causes, the consequences of this whole period of colonial rivalry.
Exactly. To sort of trace that thread through the sources.
Okay, let's dive right in. Now, the French, they weren't the first ones on the scene in the New World. What kept them? Why the delay compared to, say, Spain or even England?
Well, it really comes down to internal problems back home. France in the 1500s were just consumed by these intense religious wars, Catholics versus Huguenots.
Right, the Huguenots being the French Protestants.
Exactly, and it got incredibly violent. Think about the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in 1572, something like 10,000 Huguenots killed. It was brutal.
Wow. So internal conflict basically stalled their overseas ambitions.
Pretty much. You can't really project power effectively across an ocean when you're tearing yourselves apart at home. It just wasn't feasible until things settled down.
So how did that shift happen? How did France go from that internal strife to becoming a major European power ready for colonization?
The big turning point was the Edict of Nantes in 1598. That essentially called a truce in the religious wars, gave the Huguenots some rights, some tolerance.
Okay, so stability at home.
Yes, crucial stability. And that allowed France to consolidate, to grow stronger. By the time you get to Louis XIV, VIII in the 17th century, France is the dominant power in Europe. And with that internal peace, they could finally, turn their attention and resources outward towards the New World.
And that leads us to Quebec. Samuel de Champlain, 1608. Just a year after Jamestown was founded by the English down south. Why Quebec? What was special about that spot?
Location, right. Quebec sits right there at the head of the St. Lawrence River. Control that, and you control a massive inland waterway. It's the gateway to the interior of the continent.
A highway for trade and exploration.
Precisely. Champlain saw that immediately. It was a brilliant strategic choice for building and supplying a colony deep inside North America.
Now, Champlain didn't just claim land. He made alliances. He famously allied with the Huron Indians early on. What were the consequences of backing them, especially against their rivals, the Iroquois?
That's a decision with really long-lasting effects. By siding with the Huron, Champlain instantly made enemies of the powerful Iroquois Confederacy.
Who were enemies of the Huron already.
Exactly. So the Iroquois started retaliating. They actively blocked French attempts to expand further south, especially into the valuable Ohio Valley. They raided French settlements.
And
Ultimately, this deep-seated animosity pushed the Iroquois firmly into the British camp later on. That alliance dramatically shifted the balance of power in North America for decades. A huge consequence from that early choice.
So the French are establishing this territory, New France.
Yeah.
How was it governed? Was it like the British colonies with their assemblies and so on?
Not at all, actually. It was a very different model. New France was run much more autocratically, directly by the French king, especially after the initial attempts by private companies didn't really pan out.
So no elected assemblies, no trial by jury, like in some English colonies?
Nope, none of that. It was very centralized. And another key difference was population growth. It was incredibly slow. By 1750, there were maybe only 60,000 white settlers in New France, compared to well over 1 million in the British colonies.
Wow, that's a huge difference. 60,000 versus over 1 million.
Yeah, it created a very different kind of colonial society. Less populated, more tightly controlled from Paris.
Yet, despite that smaller population and top-down rule, the sources suggest the French were often better at building relationships with many Native American tribes compared to the British or the Spanish. How did they manage that?
It really boils down to their approach, which was quite distinct. The British often aimed for removal or, sadly, extermination. The Spanish focused on conversion and control through the mission system.
And the French?
The French, largely because their main economic interest was the fur trade, needed the Native Americans as partners. They learned, maybe out of necessity, to engage more respectfully. Gift-giving, for instance, was huge in Native diplomacy, and the French understood that.
So trade wasn't just a one-off transaction.
No, not at all. It was seen as an ongoing relationship, a process of exchange, mutual obligation. If you stopped trading, stopped giving gifts, that was basically like declaring war in many Native cultures. The French seemed to grasp this better than their rivals.
And the fur trade, particularly beaver fur, was the engine driving all this, right?
Hmm.
Tell us about the characters involved, these coureurs de bois and voyageurs.
Oh, yeah. The beaver was king. European demand for felt hats made from beaver pelts was just insatiable. It fueled everything. The coureurs de bois, literally runners of the woods, were these rugged, independent French traders.
The frontiersmen.
Exactly. They went deep into the interior, lived among the tribes, learned the languages, and traded directly for furs. Then you had the voyageurs, the boatmen, the canoe experts who handled the massive task of transporting all those furs and trade goods back and forth, often recruiting Native Americans into their crews. They really mapped out huge parts of the continent.
Alongside the traders, we also had the Jesuit missionaries playing a significant role. What was their angle? It seems complex conversion, but also exploration.
It was definitely a dual role.
Yeah.
Their primary mission was, of course, religious conversion, saving souls as they saw it, often trying to protect Native Americans from the negative impacts of the fur trade itself, like alcohol.
And this was dangerous work.
Incredibly dangerous. Many Jesuits were tortured and killed. But interestingly, their willingness to endure suffering sometimes earned them a strange kind of respect among some tribes. Beyond religion, though, they were vital explorers and geographers. They learned languages, documented cultures, mapped rivers and lakes. Their reports sent back to France were invaluable sources of information.
As French influence expanded, we see key figures making strategic moves. Antoine Cadillac founding Detroit, Robert de La Salle claiming Louisiana. What was the bigger picture there?
These weren't random acts. Cadillac founded Detroit in 1701, specifically to block the English from pushing into the Ohio Valley. It was a choke point.
Controlling movement.
Right. And La Salle's incredible journey down the Mississippi in 1682, claiming that vast territory he named Louisiana, a big part of that was about boxing in the Spanish, preventing them from expanding eastward from Mexico towards the Gulf Coast. It was a geopolitical chess game.
And they solidified this with posts along the Mississippi, like New Orleans. This wasn't just about flags on a map, was it?
No, it was about control of vital infrastructure. New Orleans, founded in 1718, was crucial for controlling the mouth of the Mississippi, blocking the Spanish in the Gulf. And those forts and trading posts further upriver, in the Illinois country, places like Kaskaskia, Cahokia, Vincennes, they became agricultural hubs.
Farming. I thought it was all furs.
Furs were key, but they needed food too. Illinois became a breadbasket, shipping grain down the Mississippi to feed the settlers in Louisiana, the Sugar Islands in the Caribbean, even exporting back to Europe sometimes. It was an interconnected system.
So you have these expanding competing empires, French, British, Spanish, bumping up against each other. Conflict seems almost inevitable. Our sources talk about 4 big world wars between 1688 and 1763.
That's right. Global conflicts with North American theaters. The first couple, King William's War and Queen Anne's War, were really the opening rounds. You saw British colonists fighting French coureurs de bois and their native allies, though the Iroquois mostly stayed out or leaned British even then.
And the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 paused things.
It did. It ended Queen Anne's War and led to this interesting period the British called salutary neglect.
Salutary neglect sounds like a good thing. Beneficial neglect.
That was the idea from London, anyway. The thinking, largely under figures like Robert Walpole, was basically leave the American colonies alone to run their own affairs, especially economically. Don't meddle too much, they'll prosper, trade will increase, and they'll cause less trouble for Britain. More wealth, less hassle.
Did it work out that way?
Well, yes and no. The colonies did prosper, but they also got used to managing their own affairs, developing their own identities, their own ways of doing things. That autonomy, born from neglect, would cause friction later when Britain tried to tighten control again.
But the peace didn't hold forever. King George's War breaks out in the 1740s.
Right. Spain joins France against Britain this time, and in North America, a really significant event happens. New England colonial troops actually capture the massive French fortress of Louisbourg on Cape Breton Island.
A huge victory for the colonists.
A huge morale boost. Louisbourg controlled the entrance to the St. Lawrence. But then, the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle ends the war in 1748, and Britain gives Louisbourg back to France as part of the deal.
Oh, the colonists must have been furious.
Absolutely livid. They felt their sacrifice was ignored, their security compromised. It left a really bitter taste and deepened the sense that maybe London didn't always have their best interests at heart.
And this simmering resentment, this ongoing fight for territory, it all leads directly into the big one. The French and Indian War, starting officially around 1754. Our sources really stress this one as the most important. Why?
Because it fundamentally decided the fate of North America. The core issue was control over the Ohio Valley. British colonists were pushing west right into the area the French absolutely needed to connect Canada with Louisiana and their Caribbean holdings.
Collision course.
Completely unavoidable. That valley was the linchpin for France's continental ambitions and a vital expansion zone for the booming British colonies.
And the spark that lit the fuse is often traced to a young George Washington's mission near Fort Duquesne in 1754. What happened there?
Yeah, a young Lieutenant Colonel Washington, sent by the governor of Virginia, basically to tell the French to get out of the Ohio country, which Virginia claimed. His small force ambushed a French detachment.
So he attacked first.
Well, it's debated who fired first, but yes, there was a skirmish, the Jumonville affair. Washington won that little fight, but then was quickly surrounded by larger French forces and forced to surrender at his hastily built Fort Necessity. It was a small event in the woods, but it had massive repercussions. Many argue it triggered a world war.
And the British reaction wasn't just focused on the Ohio. They took drastic action up in Nova Scotia against the Acadians.
Yes, a really tragic episode. The British worried about the loyalty of the French-speaking Acadians in Nova Scotia, a territory Britain had won earlier. So in 1755, they forcibly deported thousands of them.
Just rounded them up and shipped them out.
Essentially, yes. Around 4,000 initially, scattered throughout the British colonies down the coast. Many eventually made their way to French Louisiana, and their descendants are the Cajuns. It was brutal, driven purely by strategic fears during wartime.
So the war is escalating. It involves tens of thousands of American colonists fighting alongside British regulars. And then there's the Albany Congress in 1754. What was that about?
The British government called the Albany Congress for two main reasons. One, try to shore up the alliance with the Iroquois, who were wavering, keep them on Britain's side or at least neutral. Gifts were given, guns included.
Did it work? Did the Iroquois commit?
Not fully. They took the gifts, but were wary of getting drawn too deep into another European war. But the other goal of Albany, maybe the more significant one long-term, was to get the colonies to cooperate better on defense against the French.
Ah, the problem of colonial unity, or lack thereof.
Exactly. Which brings us to Benjamin Franklin's famous Albany Plan for Union.
Right, his proposal for a kind of intercolonial government.
Yeah, a remarkably forward-looking plan for a sort of colonial home rule focused on defense and managing relations with the Native Americans. The delegates at Albany actually approved it.
But it didn't happen.
No, it failed. The individual colonial assemblies rejected it because they thought it gave away too much of their own power, and the British government rejected it because they thought it gave the colonies too much power, too much independence.
So, caught in the middle. Not enough independence for the colonies, too much for London.
Precisely, and that's when Franklin published his famous Join or Die cartoon, the snake cut into pieces representing the colonies. He saw the danger of disunity.
Meanwhile, the war itself wasn't going well for the British initially. General Braddock's defeat in 1755 was a major blow.
A disaster. Braddock marched his large professional British army towards Fort Duquesne using traditional European tactics and got ambushed and routed by a smaller force of French and Indians using guerrilla warfare in the woods. Braddock himself was killed.
A wake-up call about fighting in North America.
Definitely. It showed the British Army needed to adapt, and their initial big invasion of Canada in 1756 also failed pretty badly. Things looked bleak for Britain early on.
But then things started to change with William Pitt taking charge back in London.
Yes, William Pitt the Elder. He was immensely popular, a brilliant strategist. He decided Britain needed to focus its main effort on winning in North America, whatever the cost elsewhere.
So pour resources into the colonies.
Exactly. More troops, more money, better commanders. He treated the colonies more like partners, reimbursing them for expenses, which encouraged more colonial participation. His energy really turned the tide. Capturing Fort Duquesne and renaming it Pittsburgh was a direct result of his strategy.
And the ultimate prize was Quebec. The Battle of Quebec in 1759 is legendary.
Absolutely pivotal. Pitt appointed the young, ambitious James Wolfe to lead the attack. It was a difficult siege, but Wolfe managed a daring move, getting his troops up onto the Plains of Abraham right outside the city walls.
Leading to a direct confrontation.
Yes, a classic European-style battle. The British forces won decisively. Tragically, both Wolfe and the French commander, Montcalm, died from wounds sustained in the battle. But the capture of Quebec essentially sealed the fate of New France.
So the fighting winds down, and the war officially ends with the Treaty of Paris in 1763. What did that treaty mean for the map of North America?
It was a massive rearrangement. France was basically kicked off the continent, ceding Canada and all its claims east of the Mississippi River to Great Britain.
All of it. What about Louisiana?
Ah, okay. France did give the Louisiana Territory west of the Mississippi to Spain, kind of as compensation for Spain losing Florida to Britain in the same war. But the key takeaway: French power in North America was broken. Britain was now the dominant European force overwhelmingly.
Victory for Britain. But as often happens, victory brings its own set of problems. The relationship between Britain and its American colonies actually got more strained after the war, didn't it?
It really did. It's one of those ironies of history. On one hand, the colonists came out of the war with a lot more confidence in their own military abilities. They'd fought alongside British regulars and often felt they'd performed well. Sure. But many colonial officers felt snubbed, denied promotions in the regular British Army purely because they were colonials. There was resentment there. And from the British side, there was frustration, too.
What?
About some American merchants who had continued trading with the French West Indies even during the war, basically trading with the enemy. And some colonies had initially dragged their feet about supplying troops and money until Pitt offered reimbursement. So there were feelings of mistrust and maybe a lack of appreciation on both sides.
And the biggest change, perhaps, was the removal of the French threat itself.
Yeah.
How did that impact things?
Fundamentally, with France gone from Canada and the Ohio Valley, the colonists on the frontier felt much less dependent on British troops for protection. The Spanish were further away, less of an immediate threat, and many native tribes had been weakened or displaced by the war.
So westward expansion could really take off.
Exactly. The barriers seemed to be down. Settlers surged west over the Appalachians almost immediately. And this reduced reliance on British protection naturally fostered a greater sense of American self-reliance and, you could say, separateness.
This westward push immediately created friction with Native Americans, leading to Pontiac's Rebellion in 1763. What sparked that?
Pontiac's Rebellion, or war, was a direct reaction to the shift from French to British control in the Great Lakes and Ohio Valley. Many tribes had had relatively decent relations with the French through trade and alliances. They found British policies much harsher, more arrogant. The British cut back on traditional gift-giving, restricted trade, and gunpowder, and settlers were encroaching on their lands aggressively.
So Chief Pontiac organized resistance.
Yes, Pontiac, an Ottawa leader, was instrumental in forging an alliance of several tribes who felt betrayed and threatened by the British takeover. They decided to fight back.
And it was a serious uprising.
Oh, absolutely. They launched coordinated attacks in the spring of 1763, capturing 9 out of 11 British forts in the region, killing hundreds of soldiers and settlers. It took the British Army, already stretched thin, about 18 months and considerable effort to put down the rebellion.
The sources mention a particularly grim tactic used by the British during warfare.
Yes, there's documented evidence, including correspondence from British commanders like Geoffrey Amherst, discussing and apparently implementing plans to distribute smallpox-infected blankets to Native Americans during the siege of Fort Pitt. A truly horrific measure.
In the wake of all this violence, London issues the Proclamation of 1763. What was that designed to do?
The proclamation was London's attempt to manage the chaotic situation on the frontier after Pontiac's Rebellion. It did a couple of things: establish new royal colonies, but crucially, it drew a line down the crest of the Appalachian Mountains.
It said, what about that line?
It forbade any British colonial settlement west of that line, reserving those lands for Native Americans, at least for the time being. The idea from London was to prevent further costly wars by regulating westward expansion, negotiating treaties properly, and organizing settlement in a more orderly fashion later on. It was intended as a temporary pause.
But how did the colonists see it as temporary?
Not at all. They saw it as a betrayal, especially those who had fought in the war, expecting access to those western lands. Land speculators were furious. Many ordinary colonists just saw it as the crown, blocking their opportunity, their right even, to expand westward.
So they just ignored it.
Largely, yes. Settlers continued to cross the line, but the proclamation itself became a major grievance. It felt like London was siding with the Indians against its own subjects, or at least prioritizing imperial control over colonial ambitions. It significantly damaged the relationship.
So wrapping up this deep dive, the story we get from these sources is really one of dramatic shifts. France rises, dominates vast territories, then clashes with Britain, and is ultimately pushed out. But that British victory, ironically, creates huge new problems with its own colonies.
Precisely. The very success in removing France also removed a major reason for the colonies to feel dependent on Britain. And the attempts by Britain to manage the aftermath, like the Proclamation of 1763, just fueled resentment and this growing sense that colonial interests and British imperial interests were diverging. The stage was definitely being set for future conflict.
Which leads us to a final thought for you listening. When you consider the proclamation of 1763 meant to pacify the frontier and the intense backlash it caused among the colonists, how might that single policy, that line drawn on a map, have fundamentally altered the path? Could it have been one of the key moments that accelerated the colonies down the road to revolution, even more than anyone realized at the time? Something to think about. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.